On the biggest day of her life, everything went wrong. Her faithful dog suddenly blocked her path down the aisle, causing shock among the guests. At first, she didn't realize what was happening, but what was revealed moments later changed her life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what you would do in her place. The sun filtered through the gauzy white curtains of Amalia's bedroom, casting a warm golden glow across the polished hardwood floor. It was a beautiful morning, one that should have been filled with nothing but excitement and anticipation. In just a week, she was going to stand before family and friends, pledging her love and loyalty to Daniel. It was the moment she had dreamed of for years, a culmination of careful choices and hopeful expectations. She had met Daniel 2 years ago at a corporate fundraiser, an event she had attended with little enthusiasm, but had left with a sense of destiny. He had been charming, self-assured, and completely at ease in a crowd. His smile had been a quiet promise, his words laced with intelligence and wit. They had clicked instantly, and for the first time in her life, Amalia felt that she had met someone who truly saw her. He was successful, a well-respected lawyer with impeccable manners and an effortless elegance. Her mother adored him. Her friends gushed about how lucky she was. Even her colleagues, who rarely ventured into her personal life, had commented on how perfectly matched they seemed. And yet, as she stared at the wedding dress hanging near the window, a sense of unease curled in the pit of her stomach, an inexplicable shadow in the glow of what should have been pure happiness. She tried to shake it off, blaming it on pre-wedding jitters. It was normal to feel anxious before such a life-changing event, wasn't it? A soft rustling behind her made her turn, and she saw Knox, her loyal German shepherd, watching her from his usual spot near the foot of the bed. His ears were perked up, his amber eyes sharp and focused on her. He had been behaving strangely for weeks now, ever since the wedding preparations had reached their final stage. Knox was more than just a pet. He was her protector, her constant companion through the ups and downs of her life. She had adopted him 6 years ago, when he was just a clumsy puppy, full of boundless energy and unwavering devotion. They had formed an unbreakable bond, and he had never once shown aggression towards anyone she had brought into her life. Until Daniel. It had started subtly. At first, Knox would merely watch Daniel with quiet intensity whenever he visited, never quite relaxing in his presence. Then came the soft growls, barely audible, but enough to make Amalia notice. Daniel had laughed it off at first, making light of it, calling Knox overprotective. But as the weeks passed, the dog's unease had only escalated. He would sit between them whenever they were close. If Daniel kissed her, Knox would stand, ears back, tail stiff. On more than one occasion, he had bared his teeth, not in full aggression, but in warning. Amalia had tried to reassure him, to comfort him, but nothing seemed to settle his nerves. Daniel, on the other hand, had grown impatient. "He's jealous," he had said a few nights ago, shaking his head as Knox watched them from across the living room. "Maybe we should have him stay somewhere else for a while, just until the wedding is over." Amalia had hesitated. The idea of being without Knox, even for a short time, made her uneasy. But Daniel had been so reasonable, so understanding. "I'm not saying forever," he had added with a smile, "just so he doesn't ruin the big day." She had agreed, albeit reluctantly, but that night she had woken up to find Knox standing at the door to her bedroom, his posture rigid, his body a silent warning. He had refused to move, even when she had called him. Something wasn't right. Now, as she turned back to her reflection in the mirror, she tried to push the thoughts away. She needed to focus on the wedding, on the life she was about to begin with Daniel. Still, as she reached out to touch the lace of her wedding gown, she couldn't ignore the prickle of unease at the back of her mind, or the way Knox's eyes remained locked onto her, filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. Amalia sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The rich aroma of roasted beans filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of morning dew that drifted in through the open window. It should have been a peaceful moment, a small pocket of calm before the storm of wedding preparations took over her day. But her mind was elsewhere, tangled in an unease that she couldn't seem to shake. Knox lay at her feet, his head resting on his large paws. He wasn't asleep. His ears flicked at every minor sound, his body tense, as though he were anticipating something. He had been like this for days now, his usual playfulness replaced by a quiet vigilance. Amalia reached down and ran her fingers through his thick fur, hoping to soothe him. He let out a slow exhale, but didn't relax. It wasn't just the growling anymore. Something about him had changed. Over the past week, Knox had begun acting as though Daniel was a threat. He would position himself between them, standing rigid, his body a barrier whenever Daniel came too close. The dog, who had always been obedient and composed, had started ignoring commands when they involved stepping away from Daniel. On 2 occasions, he had outright refused to leave the room when told. And then there had been last night. She had been in bed, barely drifting into sleep, when a deep guttural growl had yanked her into full awareness. Knox had been at the bedroom door, his body low, ears back, staring at something in the darkness beyond. The hallway light was on, casting a long shadow against the floor, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet Knox didn't move. He remained there, unmoving, his muscles coiled with tension. Amalia had whispered his name, but he had barely acknowledged her. The next morning, she had found him curled up in front of the closet where Daniel kept a few of his things. When she had tried to call him away, he had hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and the clothes inside. She had laughed it off, chalking it up to some strange instinct or the unfamiliar scent of a man who didn't live in her apartment full time. But now, sitting at the table, watching Knox's unrelenting tension, she wasn't so sure. Daniel's reaction hadn't helped. "He's being ridiculous," he had said, shaking his head with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You need to set boundaries, Amalia. He can't dictate who gets to be around you." She had agreed, at least she had said she did, but something about the way he had phrased it had unsettled her. It wasn't just that he was annoyed. It was something deeper, a sense of possession. A knock at the door made her jump slightly, and Knox lifted his head instantly, his ears rigid. She sighed, forcing herself to shake off the nerves, and went to open it. Lauren stood on the other side, sunglasses perched on her head, a steaming to-go coffee in one hand, and a skeptical look in her eyes. "Morning, bride-to-be," she said, stepping inside before Amalia could even greet her properly. Lauren had been her best friend since college, the one person who could always read her like a book. It was both a gift and a curse, depending on the situation. Today, it felt more like the latter. "You look like you haven't slept," Lauren observed, setting her coffee down and shrugging off her jacket. "Wedding stress?" Amalia replied, hoping that would be enough of an explanation. Lauren wasn't convinced. She glanced down at Knox, who was now sitting up, watching her with a silent intensity. "It's the dog, isn't it?" Amalia hesitated before nodding. "He's been acting weird lately, growling at Daniel, following him with his eyes like he's waiting for something to happen." Lauren's brows furrowed. Maybe he senses something. Amalia let out a small laugh. Like what? That I'm about to marry a man he doesn't approve of? Lauren didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned against the counter, considering. Look, dogs pick up on things we don't. I read a story once about a woman whose dog wouldn't stop growling at her fiancé. Turns out the guy was cheating on her. Animals just know. Amalia rolled her eyes. Knox isn't psychic. No, but he's protective, Lauren countered. And if he thinks something's off about Daniel, maybe you should listen. The words settled over her like a weight she hadn't been expecting. Because deep down, she had already been thinking the same thing, and she didn't want to admit it. Later that evening, after Lauren had left, Amalia found herself sitting on the couch, absently stroking Knox's fur while Daniel sat across from her, scrolling through his phone. He looked as composed as ever, his dark blue shirt crisp, his hair neatly styled. He was perfect. So why did she feel like something was wrong? She had spent the past 2 years convincing herself that Daniel was everything she wanted. Charming, intelligent, responsible. But looking at him now, she couldn't ignore the nagging sense that she had been too eager to believe in his perfection. Knox suddenly lifted his head, his ears twitching. Then he stood up and walked toward Daniel, his steps measured, slow. Daniel glanced up. What? Knox stopped just in front of him. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He just stared. And Daniel stared back. It was the first time Amalia saw something unfamiliar in Daniel's expression. A flicker of something that didn't quite match the polished, composed image he always projected. Irritation. No, something darker than that. It was gone in a second, replaced by a chuckle as he reached down to scratch behind Knox's ears. Still don't like me, huh? Knox didn't move. Daniel sighed and stood stretching. I should go. Big day coming up, right? He leaned down and kissed Amalia's forehead before she could react. Try to get some sleep. She nodded automatically, still watching Knox, who had turned his head just slightly, following Daniel as he walked to the door. The moment it clicked shut behind him, Knox let out a slow, low growl. A warning. And for the first time, Amalia wasn't sure she could ignore it. The morning of the wedding arrived with an eerie stillness. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale golden glow over the horizon, and the house was quiet except for the occasional rustle of fabric or the faint hum of voices from another room. Amalia sat in front of a large vanity mirror, watching as the makeup artist delicately swept a brush across her cheekbones. The woman was talking. Something about how radiant brides always had a certain glow, but Amalia wasn't listening. Her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the unease that had settled deep in her stomach over the past few weeks. Knox lay curled at the foot of the chair, his amber eyes fixed on her reflection in the mirror. He hadn't left her side all morning, moving only when she did. His presence, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a reminder, an unspoken warning that she was trying to ignore. Her wedding dress hung on the other side of the room, a masterpiece of ivory lace and delicate embroidery. It was perfect. Every detail from the subtle beading on the bodice to the way the fabric cascaded in soft waves was exactly how she had envisioned it. She had spent months planning this day, obsessing over every little element to make sure it was flawless. And yet, as she sat there, staring at her own reflection, she felt nothing but doubt. Lauren had been right. Knox had been right. But what was she supposed to do now? The guests were already arriving at the venue. Her mother was beside herself with excitement. The officiant was probably running through his notes, preparing for a ceremony that was set to begin in less than an hour. She couldn't just walk away. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. A moment later, her mother peeked inside, her eyes instantly lighting up when she saw Amalia in her silk bridal robe. "Oh, sweetheart, you look beautiful," she breathed, stepping inside with a small sigh of admiration. "I can't believe the day is finally here." Amalia forced a smile, hoping it would be enough to hide the growing storm inside her. Her mother walked over, smoothing a hand over her shoulder. "I know you're nervous, but that's normal. Every bride gets cold feet." She let out a small laugh. "I remember feeling the same way when I married your father, but the moment I walked down that aisle, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be." Amalia wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that everything she was feeling was just the natural jitters that came before such a big commitment. But deep down, she knew better. The door opened again, and this time it was Lauren. She was dressed in her bridesmaid gown, a deep shade of wine red that complemented her complexion perfectly. But despite how stunning she looked, her expression was carefully measured. She had been watching Amalia all morning, silently assessing, waiting for her to say something. "We need to start getting you into your dress," Lauren said, glancing at the clock. "The car will be here in 20 minutes. Amalia nodded mechanically. She stood, smoothing her hands down the fabric of her robe, but as she did, Knox suddenly let out a low, sharp growl. Both her mother and Lauren turned to look at the dog. "What's wrong with him?" her mother asked, frowning. Amalia hesitated, glancing down. Knox was staring at the door, his ears perked, body tense. The growl was still rumbling deep in his chest, his hackles rising slightly. Then, before she could react, there was another knock, this one firmer, impatient. "Amalia, it's me," Daniel's voice called from the other side. "Can I come in?" Knox's growl turned into a sharp bark, his entire posture shifting as if he were preparing for a fight. Amalia's heart lurched. "Not before the ceremony," her mother said quickly, moving toward the door. "It's bad luck, you know that." "I just need to talk to her for a second," Daniel insisted. "It won't take long." Amalia swallowed, glancing at Lauren. Her friend's expression was unreadable, but her eyes flickered toward Knox, then back to Amalia. It wasn't a good idea, but Amalia nodded anyway. "Just a second," she said. Her mother hesitated before sighing and stepping aside. Lauren didn't move, standing firm as Amalia crossed the room and cracked open the door. Daniel stood there, looking impeccable in his suit. His expression was warm, his smile easy, but there was something behind his eyes that made her stomach tighten. "I just wanted to see you," he said, voice soft. "I know it's bad luck, but I needed to look at you before everything starts." Knox was still growling, standing directly between them, refusing to back down. Daniel's gaze flicked to the dog, his jaw tightening just slightly. "Are we still dealing with this?" he murmured. Amalia stiffened. "What do you mean?" Daniel let out a small sigh, shaking his head. "He's been acting crazy for weeks, Amalia. Maybe it's time we acknowledge that this isn't normal." Something about the way he said it, so dismissive, so impatient, made her chest tighten. "Or maybe he sees something I don't," she said before she could stop herself. Daniel's eyes snapped to hers. For a fraction of a second, something flickered there. Something sharp, cold. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual easy smile. "You're nervous," he said, reaching up to touch her cheek. "That's all. It's just wedding nerves." Her skin burned where his fingers brushed against her. For the first time, She realized she didn't want him touching her. A soft but firm hand landed on her shoulder, grounding her. She turned slightly and found Lauren standing behind her. The message in her eyes was clear. Amalia took a step back. "I'll see you at the altar," she said, her voice even. Daniel hesitated. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Then he nodded. "Of course," he said, stepping away. Amalia closed the door before he could say anything else. She turned to Lauren, her heart hammering in her chest. "You don't have to do this," Lauren said quietly. Amalia swallowed, looking down at Knox. He was still staring at the door, his ears back, muscles tense. Something was about to happen. She just didn't know what yet. The ceremony had begun. The guests were seated beneath the grand canopy of white roses and golden lights, their murmurs blending into the soft instrumental music playing in the background. The scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass filled the evening air, and for everyone in attendance, it was the perfect setting for a wedding. The groom stood at the altar, his hands folded in front of him, exuding the usual confidence that people expected from him. Amalia's heart pounded as she stood at the entrance of the garden, hidden behind the tall hedges that separated her from the long aisle leading to the altar. The voices of the wedding coordinator and her mother blended into background noise as they flitted around her, adjusting the lace of her gown, ensuring everything was perfect. Lauren stood to her left, silent but present, her eyes fixed on Amalia with an unreadable expression. Knox sat beside her, still as stone, his eyes locked onto the scene ahead. Unlike the rest of the wedding party, he wasn't concerned with the beauty of the evening, the elegance of the decorations, or the perfection of the moment. His body was rigid, ears perked, his every breath measured. The music shifted. This was her cue. A deep breath. She took the first step forward, the fabric of her dress trailing behind her as she moved through the opening and onto the aisle. The guests rose from their seats, their faces turning toward her in admiration and awe. She saw smiles, flashes of camera lights, the way people whispered to one another about how breathtaking she looked. And then her eyes met Daniel's. He was watching her with that same easy confidence, his expression warm, his smile perfect. Everything about him seemed right. And yet, something in her gut told her otherwise. She felt Knox tense at her side. She barely had time to register it before everything unraveled. Knox lunged forward, a snarl ripping through the air so violently that the guests recoiled. The music stuttered, instruments faltering as people gasped in shock. The wedding coordinator shrieked, stumbling backward as Knox darted ahead, breaking free from Amalia's grasp. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to slow. Daniel's expression shifted. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with something else. Surprise? Anger? He barely had time to react before the massive German Shepherd crashed into him with the full weight of his body. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed, chairs toppled over as people scrambled away from the altercation. Amalia's mother clutched her chest in horror, while Lauren moved without hesitation, stepping closer to Amalia as if bracing for what would come next. Daniel hit the ground hard. Knox's snarls were feral, his teeth bared as he pinned the groom beneath him. His muzzle was inches from Daniel's face, his growls rumbling deep in his chest. "Get that dog off him!" someone shouted. The officiant took a horrified step back, the book clutched in his hands trembling. Daniel struggled beneath Knox, but the dog did not relent. His posture was aggressive, but controlled. He hadn't bitten, not yet, but his body was positioned in a way that told everyone he would if necessary. Amalia's breath caught in her throat. She knew Knox. This wasn't just an act of aggression. This was something else entirely. For weeks he had been warning her. For weeks he had tried to tell her something she refused to see. Daniel cursed, his hands pressing against Knox's fur in an attempt to shove him off. The moment he did, Knox's snarl deepened. His fangs glistened under the soft glow of the wedding lights, his muscles coiled like a spring waiting to be released. And then, as Daniel struggled, Amalia saw it. The flicker of something dark in his expression, the anger, the frustration, the brief moment when his mask slipped. It was just a second, just long enough for her to catch it. But it was enough. Enough to make her realize. Enough to make her finally see. Lauren moved before Amalia could react, her voice cutting through the noise. "Amalia!" She turned. Lauren wasn't looking at her. She was staring at someone in the crowd. A woman had pushed her way to the front, clutching a phone in her hands. Her face was pale, her expression tense, her eyes locked onto Daniel with unmistakable recognition. "I need to speak to you," the woman said, her voice shaken. "Now." Amalia barely had time to process what was happening before security rushed in. Two men grabbed Knox, pulling him away despite his resistance. The moment he was forced back, Daniel scrambled to his feet, brushing himself off with quick, jerky movements. His entire demeanor had changed. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw tight, the easygoing charm he had always exuded suddenly gone. "Jesus Christ," he hissed, his voice sharp, "you need to put that dog down." The words hit her like a slap. She turned toward him, barely hearing the guests still whispering, barely noticing the way security held Knox back. All she could focus on was Daniel, on the way he looked at her, at the way his mask had cracked just enough for her to finally see through it. The woman with the phone stepped forward, her hands shaking as she unlocked the screen. "You don't know who he really is," she said, looking at Amalia. "You need to see this." A silence fell over the crowd. Amalia felt her pulse hammer in her ears as she reached for the phone, and then, as she scanned the messages, the images, the undeniable proof, she felt her stomach drop. Daniel had lied. Not just small lies, not just harmless omissions. It was worse. So much worse. The messages revealed fraud, manipulation, a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. And Amalia wasn't the first. She wasn't even close. A sickening realization settled in her chest as she lifted her gaze back to Daniel. His expression had hardened now, his hands clenched at his sides. He saw the truth in her eyes, the moment she knew. And for the first time since she had met him, he looked afraid. Knox struggled against the security guards, his growls rising again. He knew. He had always known. The perfect man she had planned to marry wasn't perfect at all. He was a monster in disguise. And she had almost given him everything. The air was thick with tension. The once picturesque wedding venue, adorned with golden drapery and pristine white roses, had become a battlefield of silence, broken only by murmurs rippling through the stunned crowd. The guests, who had once been seated in neat rows, now stood scattered, their expressions shifting between curiosity, shock, and unease. The aisle that Amalia was supposed to walk down felt like a dividing line, before and after. Before the truth. After the truth. Daniel stood near the altar, his suit slightly rumpled from being forced to the ground. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw rigid, eyes scanning the crowd as though calculating his next move. Gone was the composed, easygoing man she had believed him to be. His mask had cracked, and for the first time Amalia saw him as he truly was. Not the charming, accomplished lawyer who had swept her off her feet, but someone who had built his life on careful deception. Knox was still restrained by two security guards, his body straining against their grip, his deep growls continuing as if he was the only one still acting on instinct. He had known long before she had. Amalia's fingers were ice cold as she held the phone the woman had given her. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, waiting, expecting her to react. The images on the screen were undeniable. Text messages, emails, legal documents, evidence of fraud, manipulation, and even previous engagements that had all ended under suspicious circumstances. Women who had once stood where she stood now, believing in the same carefully crafted illusion, only to have it crumble beneath them. "You don't understand." Daniel's voice finally cut through the noise, his tone forcibly calm. "This is a mistake." His words barely registered. Her mind was racing, flashes of the past 2 years replaying with alarming clarity. The small inconsistencies, the way he had always sidestepped questions about his past, the vague explanations, the expertly placed charm that had distracted her from the gaps in his story. She had convinced herself that none of it mattered, that every relationship had missing pieces. She had wanted to believe in the dream so badly that she had ignored the warnings, both from her own instincts and from Knox. Her heart pounded in her chest. "I don't think it is," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel's jaw tightened. Amalia turned to the woman who had given her the phone. She looked terrified, her hands still shaking, her eyes darting between Amalia and Daniel as if she feared what would happen next. "You knew him?" Amalia asked. The woman hesitated before nodding. "I was supposed to marry him." A sharp collective inhale rippled through the crowd. Amalia's stomach twisted. She already knew what the woman was going to say before she even said it. "I found out too late," the woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "By the time I realized who he really was, I'd already lost everything." She swallowed hard. "He's not who you think he is." Silence. The weight of her words settled over the gathering like a suffocating fog. Amalia turned back to Daniel. "Is this true?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." His voice had lost its warmth now, his patience thinning. "You're really going to believe the word of some woman you've never met over me?" The way he said it, "some woman," sent a shiver down her spine. There was a sharpness in his voice, an edge that had never been directed at her before, or maybe it had been, and she had just ignored it. She held up the phone. "You have an explanation for this?" Daniel took a step forward, and instantly Knox snarled, his entire body going rigid. The security guards struggled to hold him back, their grips tightening on his collar, but his growls only grew deeper, his hackles raised like a wolf ready to defend its pack. Daniel stopped. His eyes flickered, calculating. For the first time, Amalia saw hesitation. Not guilt, not remorse. Hesitation. It was a confirmation. "I think we're done here," she said, the words slipping out before she could even process them. A murmur rippled through the crowd again, louder this time. Some guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, others whispered among themselves. Daniel's face darkened. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice dropping lower. Amalia lifted her chin. "No, I almost made a mistake." The words felt strange, foreign in her mouth. She had spent the past 2 years convincing herself that Daniel was everything she wanted, everything she had been waiting for. She had let herself fall into the illusion, into the carefully curated version of him that he had presented to the world. But she wasn't the first. She had nearly become just another name on a list of women he had deceived. But she wasn't. Not today. She turned to Lauren, who had been standing silently beside her the entire time. Her friend met her gaze with quiet understanding, waiting for her to say the words that would end this once and for all. Lauren gave the smallest nod. Amalia exhaled, then turned back to Daniel. "I'm not marrying you." The words felt like an avalanche, final, irrevocable. Daniel's expression hardened, but he didn't speak. His silence was deafening, and then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. A few guests gasped as he strode past them, his movements sharp, his back rigid with barely contained anger. He didn't look back. He walked out of the garden, out of the wedding, out of her life. The moment he disappeared from sight, Knox let out a low, steady huff. The tension in his body eased, and for the first time in weeks, his ears perked forward, his posture relaxed. Amalia let out a shaky breath. It was over. The guests stood in stunned silence, waiting for something, anything, to signal what came next. Her mother looked devastated, but not surprised. The officiant stood awkwardly at the altar, glancing between the abandoned aisle and the whispers among the attendees. Lauren finally broke the silence. "Well," she said, clapping her hands together, "that was a hell of a show." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Then the tension broke. Guests began murmuring, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding as though they had suspected something all along. Some approached her cautiously, offering quiet words of support, while others simply took their leave, unsure of what to say in the wake of the collapsed wedding. Amalia didn't move. She felt frozen, her mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. The adrenaline, the shock, the realization of how close she had come to making the worst mistake of her life. Knox leaned against her leg, pressing his weight into her, grounding her. She ran a hand through his fur, exhaling shakily. Lauren touched her arm. "Are you okay?" Amalia nodded slowly, even though she wasn't sure if it was true. But she would be. She had made the right choice. And, for the first time in a long time, she listened. Not to the noise, not to the expectations, but to the one voice that had been trying to protect her all along. Knox had known. She should have listened sooner, but she had listened now, and that was what mattered. The garden was quieter now, though the remnants of chaos still lingered in the air like a thick fog. Guests had begun to filter out in hushed clusters, their conversations tense and full of speculation. Some left quickly, desperate to escape the weight of what had just transpired. Others lingered, reluctant to leave, as if expecting another twist in the spectacle they had just witnessed. Amalia stood frozen in place, her hands gripping the delicate lace of her dress, the train pooling around her feet like spilled silk. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times before. The end of the ceremony, the walk down the aisle hand in hand with her husband, the applause, the celebration. But instead of joy, she felt only exhaustion, her limbs heavy as if they had carried the weight of an entire lifetime in the past few hours. Knox was still pressed against her side, his body warm, solid, grounding. He had stopped growling, his stance no longer rigid with aggression, but he remained vigilant, his amber eyes sweeping across the remaining guests. Every few seconds his gaze flickered toward the path Daniel had disappeared down, as if making sure he wouldn't return. Amalia barely noticed when her mother appeared beside her, her face lined with disappointment and something else, relief. For a long moment she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched her daughter, as if assessing whether she was strong enough to handle what had just happened. "You did the right thing," she finally said. Amalia exhaled, her chest tight. Then why do I feel like I just destroyed everything? Her mother's expression softened. Because you almost did, but you didn't. She glanced toward where the guests were still murmuring among themselves. It's a shock, but a temporary one. People will forget. They'll move on, and so will you. Amalia wanted to believe that, but the truth was, she wasn't sure what moving on even looked like right now. Lauren appeared on her other side, holding 2 glasses of champagne, one of which she shoved into Amalia's hand without a word. "Well," she said, taking a sip from her own glass, "that was the most dramatic wedding I've ever attended, and I once went to a ceremony where the groom's ex showed up pregnant." Amalia let out a dry laugh even though she didn't feel like laughing at all. Lauren nudged her. "Listen, I know this feels like the worst thing in the world right now, but let's be real. You dodged a damn missile. Not even a bullet. A full-on, exploding, life-ruining missile." Amalia glanced at her, lips pressing into a thin line. "Then why does it still feel like I lost?" Lauren's expression softened. "Because you invested in something that wasn't real, and that hurts. It's supposed to." That was the worst part of it. She had spent 2 years building a future with Daniel, believing in the version of him that he had carefully curated for her. She had imagined their life together, had made plans, had trusted him with the parts of herself that she didn't give to just anyone. And now, all of it was gone, shattered in a single night. She looked down at Knox, who was now sitting at her feet, his ears twitching as he watched her. He had never trusted Daniel, not once. He had tried to warn her from the beginning, and she had ignored him. A lump formed in her throat. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around Knox's broad neck, burying her face in his thick fur. "I should have listened to you," she murmured. He let out a soft huff, pressing his nose into her shoulder. Lauren crouched beside her, scratching behind Knox's ears. "I hate to say I told you so," she said. Amalia scoffed. "No, you don't." Lauren grinned. "Fine, I love to say it, but I'm saying it with love." Amalia let out a shaky laugh, even as her eyes stung with unshed tears. The guests were leaving now, the murmur of their voices fading into the night. Some gave her sympathetic looks, others avoided eye contact entirely, as if pretending they hadn't just witnessed the most humiliating moment of her life. The officiant gave her an awkward pat on the shoulder before disappearing. Her mother sighed and muttered something about making calls to handle the inevitable fallout. Lauren stood, stretching her arms above her head. So, what now? Amalia stared at the remnants of her ruined wedding. The flowers, the decorations, the chairs that had been knocked over in the chaos. The half-empty champagne flutes abandoned on tables. She took a deep breath. "I think I need to get out of here." Lauren nodded. "Good, because I already told the caterers to pack up some of the food, and I stole a bottle of the good champagne." Amalia blinked at her. "You did what?" Lauren shrugged. "I figured if we're going to sit around and process this mess, we might as well do it with decent food and alcohol." Despite everything, Amalia felt the smallest, faintest hint of a smile tug at the corner of her lips. She turned to Knox. "You up for some takeout and bad decisions?" His ears perked, and she could have sworn he understood exactly what she was saying. That was all the answer she needed. Hours later, Amalia found herself sitting on the floor of her apartment, still in her wedding dress, but now barefoot, her hair undone, her makeup smudged from rubbing her eyes too many times. Lauren sat beside her, legs stretched out in front of her, chopsticks in one hand, a champagne flute in the other. Knox was curled up between them, occasionally nudging Amalia's knee with his nose. So, Lauren said, taking a bite of noodles, on a scale of 1 to 10, how tempted are you to fake your own death and move to another country? Amalia exhaled. About a 12. Lauren raised her glass. Understandable. Amalia stared at the television, which was playing some reality show neither of them were paying attention to. Her body ached from exhaustion, but her mind was still racing, replaying everything that had happened, every choice she had made. She had been so sure about Daniel, so convinced that she had finally found the right person. But Knox had known better. Lauren nudged her shoulder. Hey. Amalia turned her head. You're gonna be okay, Lauren said, her voice softer now. Maybe not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. But you will be. Amalia swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to believe that. And maybe, just maybe, she did. The morning light filtered through the half-open blinds, casting soft golden streaks across the wooden floor. The remnants of last night's impromptu feast, discarded takeout boxes, an empty champagne bottle, and a few crumpled napkins, littered the coffee table. The television still played quietly in the background, forgotten at some point in the night when exhaustion had finally won. Amalia shifted, feeling the weight of something warm pressed against her side. Knox was curled up next to her, his large head resting on her lap, his rhythmic breathing the only steady sound in the quiet room. Lauren was sprawled out on the couch, one leg hanging off the side, an empty glass still balanced precariously in her hand. For the first time since yesterday, Amalia allowed herself to breathe. Everything was different now. The future she had planned had been erased in a single evening, the illusion of security shattered. She had spent so long believing in something that was never real, and now she was left with nothing but uncertainty. And yet, as she ran her fingers absently through Knox's thick fur, she didn't feel the crushing grief she had expected. She felt relief. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, small and quiet beneath the exhaustion. Daniel was gone. The life she had thought she wanted was gone, and somehow that was okay. She shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Knox, and reached for her phone. Messages flooded her screen. Missed calls from her mother, texts from concerned friends, even a few reporters who had somehow caught wind of the spectacle that had been her wedding day. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened her photo gallery, scrolling back through the pictures she had taken over the past few years. There they were, smiling, posed, perfect, pictures of her and Daniel at dinners, on vacations, at family gatherings. To anyone else, they looked like the perfect couple. But now, as she studied them, she saw what she had never allowed herself to see before. The distance in his eyes, the careful positioning of his hands, the way he had always controlled the narrative, making sure everything appeared flawless. She had been so blinded by the idea of what their life could be that she had ignored the signs. A deep sigh left her lips, and she tilted her head back, staring at the ceiling. It was strange, how grief worked. She had expected heartbreak, expected tears and an unbearable sense of loss, but there was only emptiness. And maybe that was what hurt the most. Lauren groaned from the couch, shifting as she stretched one arm over her face. Tell me we're not awake right now. Amalia let out a small, tired laugh. We're awake. Unacceptable, Lauren mumbled, rubbing her eyes before sitting up with a groggy sigh. She blinked at the mess around them. God, it looks like we threw a party. In a way, we did. Lauren smirked. A party for surviving the worst wedding in history? Something like that. Lauren studied her for a moment, her usual sharp humor softening. How are you feeling? Amalia thought about that for a second. Better than I should." Lauren nodded approvingly. "Good. That means your brain is finally catching up with reality. Daniel was a walking red flag. Honestly, I should have worn sunglasses every time I saw you two together." Amalia exhaled through her nose. "I know. You're allowed to be mad at yourself, you know." She was, but right now she was too tired to dwell on it. Knox let out a contented sigh in his sleep, shifting slightly against her lap. Lauren nudged her foot with her own. "So, what's the plan?" Amalia frowned. "Plan?" "Yeah, you know, the thing you do when you decide you're not going to marry a con artist and have to figure out what the hell comes next." That was the question, wasn't it? What came next? For so long, she had imagined a life with Daniel. Their home, their future children, their carefully planned out existence. Now, all of that was gone, and for the first time in years, she had no idea what to do. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't really thought about it." Lauren rolled her eyes. "You never think about yourself first. Maybe it's time you do." That struck something deep in Amalia's chest. She had always been the planner, the responsible one, the one who put everything into making sure things worked, but she had never stopped to ask herself what she actually wanted. Maybe it was time to change that. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. She glanced down at Knox, who had been her anchor through all of this, and something inside her settled. "I think I just need time," she said. Lauren raised her champagne glass from last night in an exaggerated toast. To taking time. Amalia clinked her glass against Lauren's to not making terrible life choices. Lauren smirked. "We'll work on that one." They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything still pressing down on them, but somehow it didn't feel as suffocating anymore. Amalia didn't know what came next, but for the first time she was okay with that. The days stretched into weeks, and the chaos of the failed wedding began to settle into something softer, something quieter. The headlines faded, the whispers dulled. Life, as it always did, moved on. Amalia spent the first few days in a haze of exhaustion, avoiding phone calls, ignoring messages, and refusing to engage in any conversation about Daniel. Her mother tried to check in, carefully tiptoeing around the topic, but Amalia wasn't ready. Lauren had been her buffer, fielding calls and running interference, but even she knew that Amalia couldn't stay in limbo forever. Knox, ever her shadow, never left her side. He seemed lighter now, less on edge, as if his mission had been completed, as if he had done what he had always set out to do: protect her. She let herself move through the motions, taking long walks with Knox through the city, wandering through bookstores without any real intention of buying anything, sitting in coffee shops and watching the world move around her. For the first time in a long time, there was no pressure, no expectation, no plan, and that, more than anything, terrified her. She had spent years meticulously crafting the life she thought she wanted. She had worked hard, made careful choices, followed the path that had always been laid out before her. But now, standing on the other side of something she had once believed was her future, she realized she had no idea who she was outside of it. One afternoon, while scrolling aimlessly on her phone, she found herself looking at an old photo of her and Knox. It had been taken years ago, before Daniel, before all of this. They were at an animal shelter, surrounded by dogs of all shapes and sizes. She had volunteered there for a time, before life had gotten too busy, before she had convinced herself that she didn't have the time. She stared at the photo for a long time, feeling something stir inside her. The next morning, she found herself standing outside that same shelter. It hadn't changed much. The brick building still had the same slightly faded sign hanging above the door. Inside, the scent of clean straw and disinfectant filled the air, mixed with the faint, familiar sound of dogs barking. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Hi there. Can I help you?" Amalia hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish for showing up without a plan, but before she could second-guess herself, she found herself saying, "I was wondering if you needed volunteers." The woman's smile widened. "We always need volunteers." And just like that, Amalia started spending her days at the shelter. At first, it was just a few hours here and there, helping with feedings, walking the dogs, cleaning up. But as the days passed, she found herself staying longer, losing track of time, feeling something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized she had been missing. Knox was a fixture there, too. The staff adored him, and the other dogs seemed to look to him for some kind of silent guidance. He was patient with the anxious ones, gentle with the younger ones, always watching, always aware. One afternoon, as she was finishing up for the day, she walked past a row of kennels and stopped. There, curled up in the corner of his enclosure, was an older golden retriever. His fur was peppered with silver, his eyes warm but tired. Unlike the other dogs, who eagerly jumped at the sight of a visitor, he simply watched her, his tail giving the smallest, slowest wag. Her heart clenched. She knelt down, pressing her fingers against the metal bars. "Who's this?" she asked. One of the staff members walked over. "That's Lucky. He's been here a while. Older dogs are harder to place." Lucky lifted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes meeting hers. Amalia swallowed past the lump in her throat. She knew that feeling. Being overlooked, being left behind. She exhaled. "I'll take him." The words surprised even her, but as soon as she said them, she knew they were right. The staff member blinked. "You want to adopt him?" She nodded. "Yeah, I do." Lucky was hesitant at first, unsure of her, unsure of Knox, but within hours of being home, he had settled into the space as if he had always belonged. That night, she sat on the floor of her apartment, Knox curled up beside her, Lucky on her other side. She ran her fingers through Lucky's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. She had spent so much time grieving a future that had never been real, mourning a life that had never truly been hers. But sitting here now, surrounded by the quiet comfort of these two dogs who had come into her life at different times but for the same reason, she realized that she had gained something far more valuable. She had found herself again. And maybe, just maybe, that was the best thing that had ever happened to her. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos. Check out more stories like this by watching the next video or exploring our other content. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who would love it too. Thanks for watching.